All right, everybody, welcome back to another fantastic episode of Bear's Guide to a 5. Today, we're talking about types of states. Now, the goal today, I bet you never even imagined that there were different types of states, but yeah, there are different types of states, and that's what we are going to focus on today. Very, very, very straightforward, we hope. So you have two types of states. Now, in the previous lesson, we talked about the differences between race, ethnicity, and nationality. And right away, we're using that knowledge to differentiate between our first two types of states. We have multi-ethnic states and we have multinational states. And it sounds exactly like what it is. In multi-ethnic states, you have multiple ethnicities. In multinational states, you have multiple nationalities. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, Mr. Bear, this is really easy. I don't understand. Why is this so difficult? Why are you freaking out? Oh, just you. So, in multi ethnic states, everyone has allegiance to the same country, but to different cultures. So, very much like the United States. Like, all of us are all citizens of the United States, but we all have our own individual ethnicities that and our own cultures that we have allegiance to. And we'll go more in depth in that. We'll explore more of that here soon. Multinational states have multiple nationalities, where people have more allegiance to part of the country than the whole country. And the best example for this, guys, is the United Kingdom. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait, I thought the UK was one country. It's not. It's made up of four nationalities of I don't want to say four independent countries because they're not four independent countries that like work together. The country is the United Kingdom. But the four nationalities, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England make up the UK, right? So individual nationalities are also their ethnicities. And sometimes those nationalities that have ethnic ties feel they have the right to this thing called self-determination, but live mutually with others. Now, we are going to get more in depth on what self-determination means in the future. So, what does this mean? In multi-ethnic states, the individual ethnicities don't have power in government, right? It's not like in Congress you have, separate portions of people in the United States. Like we do by state, but we don't split it up by ethnicity. There's not like the Asian American Congress, there's not the Black American Congress, there's not the Hispanic American Congress, there's not the White American Congress. Well, it's just Congress. So the individual ethnicities don't have power in government. Whereas in multinational states, the individual ethnicities do have power in government because those ethnicities are considered nationalities. They have ties to a citizenship, right? When you ask someone from the UK, like, hey, where are you from? They don't go, I'm a UKer. That doesn't make any sense. They go, oh, I'm Irish, or I'm Welsh, or I'm British. I'm Scottish, right? They have that ethnic tie and that national tie to that area. Whereas in the United States, everybody identifies themselves as a combination of their ethnicity and their nationality. So as I mentioned before, the UK is a great example of this. 4 teams to the World Cup instead of 1 because they're a multinational state. So multinational states also include Belgium. Now, there are other multinational states in the world. Please don't think it's limited to just these two. But what's important here to understand is that these are just 2 really great examples of multinational states. So say you get an FRQ question, you have these in, your little toolkit of knowledge that you can bring out and use. Another great example of a multinational state is the old USSR. If you look, what's covered in orange is the USSR, and then you see all those individual names because that's the countries they are today. Before, these countries didn't exist. It was all just the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And then after the USSR fell, these individual nationalities had this idea of self-determination, what I mentioned earlier, and we're going to talk more about this whole right to govern yourself, and they form their own countries, right? And they're the ones that are really hard to spell when we take that Eastern European map quiz. But But what you have to know too is that Russia is still the largest multinational state today. Even though the USSR was the largest multinational state, even after the breakup of the USSR, Russia is still the largest multinational state. A lot of nationalities inside of Russia, a lot of nationalities that don't necessarily like Russia, and they want to be their own country. All right, so now we're going to talk about our third type of state, by far the easiest one to understand, nation states. Now, a nation state is when the political boundaries, its formal region, matches its ethnic boundaries. An easier way to think of that is if 90+% of people that live in that country, if their nationality is the same as their ethnicity, it's a nation state. Now, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, political leaders throughout the world, old colonizers, organizations that grant people sovereignty, and I know that sounds crazy, but that's the only way to explain it, but grant these ethnicities, the ones who have the ideas of self-determination, that these individual ethnicities want to govern themselves, they want their own nation. We're going to talk about nations breaking off and people forming these nation states because they want to govern themselves. Our fourth type of state that we got to talk about are multi-state nations. These are people who have a state, but they're spread into another state. And the only example you really, really need to know of this, I mean, I'm sure there are other examples. Actually, I know other examples, but the one that's really, really easy is just to understand North and South Korea, because the ethnicity is Korean, but it's split between the North and South Korean border. So you have one ethnicity split between two nations, so it's a multi-state nation. Our fifth type of state is a stateless nation. So I guess it's not a state, but it's a stateless nation. So separate nationalities with self-determination to be on their own, but they do not have a state. And I know that's really complicated or kind of confusing to think about. Now, these stateless nations are generally people who are spread across multiple states. A great example, or a list of examples, we have the Kurds in the Middle East, we have the Hmong in Southeast Asia, Zulu in Southeast Africa, the Palestinians in the Middle East, the Quebecois in Canada, who we've talked about, the Catalonians in Spain, and the Basques in Spain and France. We're going to talk about all these different people. We're going to examine all of their struggles and their ideas of self-determination and wanting to become their own state. But before we do that, we have to understand that they even exist. Now, the interesting thing with stateless nations is that they all want the same thing. They all want their own country. They all want their own sovereignty, their own ability to govern themselves without being told. But the fact is that these different people or peoples fall on a spectrum of how close they are to that goal. And the way that we're going to talk about it is that the government that's there, whatever state they are in, right? Because stateless nation people are inside of a state. They're either in a multi-ethnic state or a multinational state or a multi-state nation or a nation state. But the fact of the matter is that they're there. And sometimes the governments can give them this thing called autonomy. Now, sovereignty is the ability to govern yourself without anybody telling you what to do. Autonomy is the ability to have some power over your own decisions, your own people, but you don't have sovereignty, because at the end of the day, the government that's there still has control over you. So I know this is a little confusing, so I made you a chart. What does autonomy mean? So an area of a country that has a degree of autonomy or freedom from external authority, and these places are generally stateless nations. So on the left, you have fully autonomous, which is basically sovereign, and all the way on the right, you have no autonomy. That means no power at all. So all the way on the left, fully autonomous states are sovereign states. The United States is a sovereign state. Canada is a sovereign state. Germany is a sovereign state. No one can tell them what to do, right? No one can tell the U.S. how to govern. Other leaders can tell us, hey, that's a bad idea, or hey, that's wrong. But laws that are written in Germany don't apply here in the United States. That's what it means to be sovereign. Whereas autonomous means that you do have some power, you do have the ability to make some rules, but at the end of the day, you have to listen to the government. So some examples of that are the Quebecois in Canada, the Catalonians, Scotland, the Basque people, the Walloons, the Flemings, and I know these are all just random words I'm throwing at you, but it's going to make sense when you're in here in class. But what you got to know is that they have a government that makes rules inside its borders, right? In Quebec, the Québécois, there's a Quebec government. We talked about the Quebec government. We talked about how they have the language police. We've talked about how they have power, how they make money, how they can have referendums to become their own state, how they choose how migration works in their country. Or not their country, but their area. But at the end of the day, if the Canadian government tells Quebec to do something, Quebec has to do it. And that's the difference between autonomy and sovereignty. Now, generally, semi-autonomous places, these are people that have some of the power that, these autonomous groups do, but at the end of the day, they are held back a little more. These are the U.S. Native Americans, these are the Palestinians in Israel, these are the Kurds in the Middle East, and the Tibetan people in Western China. They have a government, but that government isn't strong enough to actually do anything. It doesn't have the political power to vote to become its own country, and generally they have a weak economy. Now, that's the distinction I want to make too, is the economy. Generally, the stronger the economy is for the stateless nation, the more autonomy they have. And we're going to get into why that happens, but it shouldn't shock anybody that the more money you have, the more power you have. And then examples of no autonomy. These are the Uyghur people, these are the Rohingya, these are the Jewish people before the state of Israel. They have no government to represent them. They are persecuted by stronger governments. There's no economy. Guys, when we saw the videos of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, that's a stateless nation. They have nowhere to go. They have no power, right? So when we talk about stateless nations, we have to understand that it's a spectrum of autonomy. It's not just all stateless nation people have no autonomy or they're all autonomous. It is a complex spectrum, and we are going to explore this and talk a lot about this, so it's okay if you're confused right now. And as I mentioned, and we're going to talk a lot in class, one of the best examples of a stateless nation people, I gave you a lot of great examples, and I think knowing at least one example from each category of autonomy is important. But if you really, if for some reason your brain can only hold one stateless nation people, that would be the Kurds throughout the Middle East. And we are going to do a case study in class on how complex the Kurdish situation is. So what do you need to know today? I know that this stuff is tough so far. So let's keep it simple. You need to know what makes a multinational state. You need to know what makes a multi-ethnic state. You need to know what makes a nation state. You gotta know what makes a multi-state nation. You gotta know what makes a stateless nation. Wow, who could have seen any of this coming? But you also have to have examples for all of these types of states. I cannot stress enough how important it is that we have examples to tie to these things that we talk about in class, because on the AP exam, they're going to throw an FRQ at you, and the more examples, the more real-life examples you have tucked away ready for anything, will one, only make you more prepared for the AP exam, but two, blow away the reader and get a really good score. And then finally, the last thing you have to know is understand the scale of autonomy. That would be that chart that goes from fully autonomous to no autonomy. So I know this was a tough lesson, and it is a little complicated. So if you have any questions, make sure to write them down in your notebook and bring them up in class when you see me. As always, this was Bear's Guide to a 5. Make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe so you're up to date when new videos get released, and I'll see you next time.